I'm Alexandra Pierce, 32 years old, a soldier, a strategist, and the daughter in a family that never wanted me to outshine its golden heir. At home, Ethan, my older brother, was always the chosen one, every triumph displayed like a crown jewel, while my service was brushed off as a phase. Then came the headline: Pierce heiress wastes talent in obscure military role. My own family had fed the story, turning years of sacrifice into public humiliation. Ever been erased from your own family's story? Hit like if you've ever had your worth ignored, and comment if you know the feeling of being sidelined. It started with that dinner. My mother's summons, her voice more command than invitation. Inside, the air was warmer, perfumed faintly with lilies and something rich from the kitchen. The butler took my coat with the detached grace of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The chandelier above the entry hall scattered amber light onto marble floors, making everything seem dipped in honey. My mother appeared in the doorway to the dining room, wearing a jewel-toned gown that caught the light every time she moved. "Alexandra," she said with a smile that could slice glass. "You look rested." Her eyes flicked over me as if assessing whether I still fit the family's unspoken dress code. "Traffic wasn't bad," I replied, my own smile polite but distant. In the dining room, my father stood at the head of the table flanked by Ethan. The table itself was a display of precision, silverware lined with military accuracy, crystal gleaming under the chandelier's glow. Ethan looked every inch the heir apparent. Tailored suit, relaxed confidence, the kind of posture that said he'd never doubted his place at the table. "Alex?" my father said, acknowledging me with the tone one might use for a junior associate who'd managed to show up on time. "Good of you to make it." I took my seat halfway down, directly across from Ethan. We exchanged a glance that was all veneer, his smug, mine unreadable. Once wine had been poured, Ethan leaned back in his chair, holding the room like a stage actor who knew his spotlight. "We closed the Denver project ahead of schedule," he said. "Scaled deployment, flawless delivery. The board's thrilled." My mother's eyes glistened with pride. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said warmly. Richard nodded. "Execution, discipline. That's how you win." Ethan glanced at me over his glass. "Maybe you should come by one of our strategy sessions sometime, Alex. See how things get built that last." "Strategy sessions do have a rhythm," I said evenly. "The trick is hearing it under the noise." He smiled, a slow, patronizing curve of the mouth. "We'd tune it for you." Patricia, my father's cousin and self-appointed keeper of family decorum, tilted her head toward me. "And what about you, dear? Still between things?" "I'm not between anything," I replied, my tone as smooth as the wine in my glass. "I just prefer not to measure life in quarters and KPIs." The servers appeared with the main course, thick-cut steaks seared to perfection, vegetables arranged with artistic precision. My father waited until the last plate was set before speaking again, his voice carrying the weight of judgment dressed as concern. "When will you start doing something truly useful, Alex?" His eyes held mine. "You're bright, capable, but talent without application is wasteful." Around the table, there were small reactions. Margaret's barely perceptible inhale, Patricia's stillness, Robert's glance at his watch. Ethan just leaned back, watching. I cut into the meat with deliberate care, then set the knife down. "Application is context-dependent," I said. "Meaning?" my father asked. "Meaning, some work matters more than it looks from a distance." I kept my gaze steady on him, letting the pause stretch long enough to make him shift slightly in his seat. Ethan laughed quietly. "She's happy, Dad. Let her collect experiences." His tone was warm, but his eyes glinted with the satisfaction of an older brother who believed he'd already won. "But if you ever want a tour of reality, my door's open." "Reality seems to be doing fine without me," I said, taking another sip of wine. The conversation drifted back to market trends and upcoming galas. I let it wash over me, cataloging each small tell, my father's self-satisfied nods, Ethan's compulsive glance at his phone, my mother's watchful patience. They were so confident in their narrative about me, as though the map of my life had been etched years ago and no new paths were allowed. When dessert arrived, my mother reached for my hand. "Do you ever miss stability, knowing exactly where your day goes?" "I've never been more stable," I told her, and meant it. Patricia's voice cut in, sweet but probing. "But where does it lead, darling? Eventually one needs structure, a family." "Some structures," I said, "are just cages with better lighting." The laugh around the table was polite, uncertain. My father folded his napkin precisely, signaling the meal's descent toward its end. "If you ever decide to apply yourself, Alexandra, we'll make space," he said. "Until then, make good choices." I smiled, the expression more armor than warmth. "You're very kind, truly." Turning to Ethan, I added, "And congratulations on Denver. Execution, discipline." He preened, pleased I'd been listening. "Always nice to be recognized." "Oh, I'm always listening," I said. For just a second, the air between us sharpened. Then, buzz. Ethan's phone lit up in his lap. A line of text appeared in the preview window, stark and unmissable. "The article drops tomorrow morning." The article didn't just question my career. It painted me as a family embarrassment. The headline screamed from my tablet as if it had been waiting for me to wake. "Pierce heiress wastes talent in obscure military role." Below it, a glossy photo from some charity event years ago. Me in uniform, captured mid-blink as though even the photographer had been complicit in making me look detached, out of place. The copy that followed was a neat blend of condescension and innuendo, a reluctance to engage in the private sector, a pattern of avoiding measurable responsibility, and the piece de resistance, anonymous quotes from sources close to the family about my failure to capitalize on unique opportunities. The Potomac shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, the morning sun throwing gold shards across the water. The view was perfect, deliberate, and in that moment, useless. I scrolled through the article slowly, every sentence landing like a tiny, precise blade. This wasn't lazy gossip. It had fingerprints, calculated framing, strategically chosen language, and it wasn't just about me. The memory came uninvited. 5 years ago, the night the Pierce & Co. network nearly collapsed under a coordinated cyber attack. I'd been halfway across the world, pulling a double shift on an Allied operations base, when Dan Whitaker had called me in. Not to save my family's company, at least not directly, but to trace the breach before it reached defense-related contracts. Back then, I'd done the work quietly, without credit. It had been enough just to prevent catastrophe. Now I wondered if that restraint had been a mistake. My secure line buzzed, the tone pitched low enough only I could hear. Dan's voice came through, crisp, even over the encryption. "Read it yet?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "It's cleaner than I expected. Whoever planted it knows what they're doing." "Not just planted," Dan replied. "Amplified. It's in 3 syndicates already." He paused. Pierce & Co. had another security flag last night. Small but familiar. Someone's rattling the cage. I turned from the window, crossing to the desk where my military-grade laptop sat. Internal? Too early to confirm, he said. But the signature, it's not random. A sliver of tension ran under his words, the kind he tried to keep hidden. Dan, I said, 5 years ago you told me Pierce & Co. systems were patched for good. Patched? Yes. Immune? No. You know how this works. Threat actors evolve, and sometimes they're sitting closer than you think. I exhaled through my nose. And now I'm in the crosshairs personally. That's not a coincidence, he said, which means you're on a clock. Before I could respond, a soft chime announced an incoming encrypted message. I glanced at the ID. Eleanor Graves. Retired now, but her reputation as a field strategist was the kind of legend they didn't put in the official histories. The text was short, deliberate. Keep tonight free. Someone important needs to see you. No names, no location, just a timestamp and coordinates embedded in the metadata. I decrypted them automatically. An upscale bistro on the edge of Georgetown. One that catered to power lunches and quiet deals. Dan was still on the line. I know that look, he said. What is it? Eleanor wants a meeting, I told him. That's not social, Dan said flatly. She doesn't burn bandwidth unless it's critical. I know. Alex, be careful. If they're coming at you from both angles, personal and digital, they're building a case or a trap. That's why I'm going, I said. My tone was even, but my reflection in the darkened laptop screen showed eyes sharpened to a point. The secure call ended, leaving the quiet hum of the apartment and the faint sound of river traffic outside. I set the tablet down, sliding the article into an encrypted archive. The sting of it had already shifted into something colder, more precise. Smears were just another form of misdirection, and I'd learned long ago how to read what they tried to hide. I reached for my coffee, its heat grounding me for a moment before turning back to the laptop. That's when the screen blinked, once, twice, and an alert bloomed across the interface in sharp military font. Unauthorized intrusion detected. The trace algorithm ran before I even touched the keys. Coordinates locked in within seconds. The origin was unmistakable. Pierce & Co.'s internal network. I saved their empire once. They never knew. Someone else took the credit. The war room hummed with the steady pulse of active servers and the faint tap of keyboards, the air sharp with recycled coolness. On one wall, a dozen oversized screens streamed live threat maps, pulses of red tracing intrusion attempts across continents. My badge had barely finished scanning when Dan strode toward me, his jaw set in that way that meant the news was bad. They've escalated, he said without preamble, gesturing me toward the central display. Pierce & Co. is facing a renewed, coordinated push, originating from multiple regions, but the signature is familiar. I studied the data as it refreshed, packets spiking in rhythmic intervals, masking their path through legitimate nodes. It wasn't the raw aggression of an amateur. It was surgical, patient, the kind of hand that had done this before. The memory rose without invitation, carrying me back to the early hours of a January morning in 2019. I'd been working a joint cyber defense exercise when an emergency ping broke protocol. The message was marked critical asset threat, the kind that made your pulse quicken even before you knew the details. Pierce & Co. was hemorrhaging data. No one in the room then knew I had ties to the company. The name Pierce was just another private sector flag in the incident queue. But I recognized the pattern instantly. An exploitation chain that had been testing smaller systems for months before finally making its move. We rerouted, counter-infiltrated, locked down servers one by one. It took 14 straight hours. I led the maneuver that traced the breach to an offshore syndicate, then buried a false data cache to pull them off. When it was over, Pierce & Co. had lost nothing, and yet, when the press conference came, it wasn't me standing at the podium. It was Harold Stein, senior executive, family confidant, and opportunist. He wore the victory like tailored silk, smiling for the cameras as though he'd written every line of code himself. Pierce & Co. remains unbreakable, he'd declared, the words echoing in the news cycle for days. Not a single mention of the operation team, certainly not of me. That was the day I learned that saving an empire didn't mean it would remember you. The screens in the war room flickered, drawing me back to the present. Dan's eyes were fixed on the data feed.
We're seeing command and control nodes that match the 2019 pattern.
Harold, I said, not as a question. Dan didn't confirm, but the pause in his response said enough.
If he's involved, he's covering his tracks better this time. But there's something else. You need to see this.
Eleanor appeared in the doorway, crisp as ever in a dark blazer, a slim dossier in her hands. She crossed the room without a word, setting it in front of me. The top page was a timeline, 5 years' worth of corporate board movements, cybersecurity contracts, and private meetings. And in the middle of it all, Harold Stein's name, connecting dots that weren't supposed to touch. "This is verified," Eleanor said, her voice low. "He didn't just benefit from the 2019 incident. He may have orchestrated the breach to position himself as the savior." I flipped through the pages, the pieces aligning into something uglier than theft of credit. Harold hadn't just stolen my work. He'd engineered the crisis that made my work necessary. And now, if Eleanor's data was right, he was mobilizing again. Dan leaned closer. "We tie this breach to him. We don't just stop the attack. We take him down for good. Then we follow the trail," I said. "Every packet, every false flag, we make the link unbreakable." The hum of the room felt louder now, like the tension was feeding the circuits. Eleanor closed the dossier with deliberate care. "This won't be clean," she warned. "Harold has protection inside and outside the company. You make a move, he'll see it coming." "That's fine," I said. "He's been underestimating me for 5 years." Dan's comm unit chirped, and he glanced at the incoming note. His expression shifted, the tightness around his mouth deepening. "Alex," he said, his voice carrying weight. "Charles Bennett just returned from overseas. A family dinner is just a battlefield with better lighting." The chandeliers above the Pierce dining room cast a honeyed glow over polished crystal, bone china, and the stiffly folded napkins that felt like props in a theater. 12 high-backed chairs framed the mahogany table, and in each seat, a carefully curated member of the family tableau. Every smile measured, every word an opportunity. The first toast was for Ethan, of course. My brother rose with the same easy charm that had always come naturally to him, champagne flute in hand, recounting his latest business victory with practiced humility. "It's really the team who made it happen," he said, letting the pause hang just long enough for the applause to swell. Then, almost as an afterthought, he glanced at me. "We all have our ways of making an impact, don't we?" Margaret, seated across from me in her usual position of silent authority, lifted her glass and added, "To Ethan, for keeping the Pierce name in headlines that matter." Her eyes didn't so much as flicker in my direction, but the weight of the remark landed anyway. I held my smile, letting the moment pass without a bite. My plate was still untouched when Patricia, my aunt with a knack for surgical cruelty, leaned in. "Alexandra, dear," she began in a tone syrupy enough to mask the blade, "when will you finally settle down? You've spent so many years roaming. Isn't it time to leave the soldier life behind and start thinking about A husband? I set my fork down with deliberate care. I appreciate the concern, Patricia, I said evenly, but the soldier life has its rewards. Robert Blake, her husband, chuckled low in his throat. Rewards? Not the kind that get your name on Forbes covers, I'd wager. Ethan's timing was impeccable. Speaking of covers, have you seen today's piece? He tilted his head, voice dripping with feigned sympathy. Rough headline, Pierce heiress wastes talent in obscure military role. The journalist clearly doesn't know you the way we do. The table stilled just enough for me to feel the shift in air pressure. This was what they wanted. The flash of temper. The proof that I could be rattled. I met Ethan's gaze, steady and unblinking. I've been busy doing things the press isn't allowed to print, I replied, my tone light, almost conversational. A few of the cousins looked up, sensing something in my voice they couldn't quite place. Margaret's smile froze at the edges. Patricia adjusted her napkin. Ethan took a slow sip from his glass, though I noticed the faint tension in his jaw. The rest of the meal played out in low volleys, remarks wrapped in civility, countered with precision. I asked Emma about her studies abroad, complimented Robert on a recent charity event. Every exchange was a negotiation, a careful calibration between appearing engaged and giving away nothing. The food might as well have been sand. No one seemed to notice, too intent on the game unfolding across the table. The clink of silverware was interrupted by the soft but firm sound of the dining room door opening. The butler stepped inside, posture impeccable. "Mr. Charles Bennet has arrived." The room's atmosphere shifted in an instant. Wariness in Richard's glance, curiosity from the others. I kept my expression composed, though the name alone was enough to set my thoughts in motion. This was no casual visitor. The silence after his greeting was heavier than any gunfire I'd heard in combat. Charles Bennet's voice had landed in the center of the table like a weighted anchor, dragging every false smile and polite murmur into stillness. He stood just beyond the threshold, coat draped over one arm, his expression as calm and unreadable as I remembered. The last time I'd shaken his hand, we were standing on a tarmac under a blacked-out sky, exchanging no words about the operation we'd just survived. Now, the setting was a dining room wrapped in crystal and gold leaf, but the atmosphere carried the same undercurrent of unspoken stakes. "Alexandra," he said, inclining his head toward me, "your leadership under pressure remains unmatched." Margaret's fork clinked faintly against her plate. Ethan's smile, already thin, froze altogether. Richard straightened, then quickly shifted his gaze toward Charles with the measured politeness reserved for powerful guests. "We were just finishing dinner," he said smoothly, "but you're, of course, welcome to join us." Charles stepped forward, settling into the empty seat beside mine. He didn't waste a moment on small talk. "I won't keep you long," he began, resting his forearms lightly on the table. "There are urgent matters regarding security at Pierce & Co., issues that demand Alexandra's immediate oversight." The statement was both casual and deliberate, his voice carrying a certainty that made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a directive. Richard gave a quick, dismissive chuckle. "I'm sure our internal team can—" "They can't," Charles cut in without raising his voice. The interruption was surgical. "This breach is sophisticated, and your standard protocols are already compromised. Alexandra has the authority and the clearance to manage it. My recommendation is that she lead the response, effective now." Every eye at the table shifted toward me, some with open skepticism, others with the discomfort of people watching a hierarchy rearrange itself in real time. I could feel the ripple in the room, the quiet shift from dismissal to reluctant recognition. Margaret leaned slightly toward me, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the surrounding stillness. "And how long," she asked, "have you been doing this?" Her emphasis wasn't on the word doing, but on this, as if she were pointing to something I had no right to claim. I didn't answer immediately. I took a slow sip from my glass, letting the seconds stretch. "Long enough," I said finally, "to know this conversation should be happening in a secure channel, not over dinner." Charles's lips curved in the faintest echo of a smile. "Exactly." He let the word hang, then leaned back as if the matter were closed. Richard made one last attempt at steering the discussion toward neutral waters, asking about an upcoming charity gala. Charles nodded politely, but returned within 2 sentences to the matter at hand. "Your systems are bleeding data, Richard, and it's not coming from the outside." The shift in air was immediate. Small movements, a glance exchanged between Patricia and Robert, Margaret's hand tightening around her wine glass. I didn't look at Ethan, but I could feel his attention like heat on the side of my face. Charles turned his head slightly toward the far end of the table, where Eleanor had just stepped inside. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, then, almost imperceptibly, both of them looked at Ethan. If truth was a weapon, I'd been sharpening it for 5 years. The war room's glow was cold and relentless, a hive of screens mapping the invisible battle lines across networks and firewalls. Streams of data poured in, each line a potential clue or a lie in disguise. Dan Whittaker stood at the center, sleeves rolled up, his posture tense. "It's the same exploit," he said, voice low enough that only I could hear over the constant hum of machines and quiet voices. "The one Harold Stein swore was patched back in 2019. I didn't need to look at the screens to see it in my mind. The signature of the breach, a familiar fracture in the system's armor. It was like recognizing the hand of a thief by the angle of a broken lock. The memory unspooled without my consent. 5 years ago, I'd been buried in the chaos of Pearson Co.'s digital defenses, pulling the company back from the edge of annihilation. The cyber attack had been surgical, aimed at both crippling operations and leaking sensitive contracts. I'd run the team like a battlefield unit, directing countermeasures, setting traps for the intruders, and finally locking them out just minutes before critical data was set to be exfiltrated. And then Harold had stepped into the press conference, all polished charm and the perfect Navy suit. He'd talked about his team's tireless efforts while I watched from the shadows, still smelling of stale coffee and server room dust. Cameras flashed for him. My name never surfaced. The bitterness of that moment had faded into something harder, sharper, like metal tempered over flame. Dan slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were documents, clean and damning. A shell company registered in Delaware, innocuous on the surface, but its financial trail ran straight to Harold. The same company was now traced to offshore accounts funding the breach we were fighting. "He didn't just fail to patch it," Dan said grimly. "He's using it." I let the weight of the evidence settle. This wasn't just corporate negligence. It was sabotage. It was personal. Harold had stolen my victory, and now he was using the same tools to damage both my family's company and the security I was sworn to protect. My decision formed in the space of a heartbeat. "We'll stop the breach," I said, "but I'm not leaving Harold standing when it's over." Dan studied my face for a moment, then nodded once. You'll need to move carefully. If he knows you're on to him, he'll run, I finished for him. Not this time. Before we could continue, my secure phone lit up with Eleanor's name. I answered, and her voice came through without preamble. Be ready, she said, her tone edged with a kind of satisfaction I hadn't heard in years. Things are about to get interesting. The main course was over. The real negotiations began in the living room. The dining table behind us still gleamed with half-empty wine glasses and the fading heat of untouched vegetables. Here, in the dim light of the Pierce Mansion's living room, the air was thicker, quieter, like the space between moves in a high-stakes chess match. Richard stood near the sideboard, swirling a glass of whiskey he hadn't yet tasted. Ethan lounged too casually in an armchair, scrolling his phone with the faux distraction of someone listening for his name. Charles sat opposite me, posture relaxed but gaze locked, while Eleanor settled beside the fireplace, saying nothing, her attention a weight of its own. Charles was the first to cut the silence. Richard, with your permission, I'd like Alex to walk us through what she's already uncovered. I caught Ethan's eye for the briefest second before I began. The breach isn't hypothetical, it's active, and it's using vulnerabilities your systems should have closed years ago. If an attacker has the right leverage, they can move from financial records to contracts, and from there to influence over decision-making itself. Ethan gave a short laugh. We've got redundancies. This is not under control, I interrupted, my voice level but edged. What I'm sharing is already sanitized for your comfort. If I gave you the real scope, you'd stop talking and start locking down your accounts. Richard's brow furrowed as he set the whiskey aside. You're telling me someone could alter bidding outcomes, restructure ownership shares, manufacture debts that don't exist. I leaned forward. It's not just about stealing money. It's about reshaping who holds the reins. Ethan tried again, his tone clipped. Let's not blow this out of proportion. We don't know. I pulled a small folder from my bag and slid it toward him. Inside was a single redacted page, enough to show packet traces from an intrusion mapped to Pierce & Co.'s own internal network. His smirk faltered. Richard glanced between us, the whiskey forgotten. You have more of this? Much more, Charles said before I could answer. And unless you want this turning into a public crisis, we should formalize Alex's role tonight. That was when he laid it on the table. A memorandum of understanding, crisp paper on the low glass coffee table. This will give her direct authority to coordinate with your IT teams and any outside security consultants we deem necessary. Eleanor's expression didn't shift, but her eyes tracked every move, every hesitation. Richard hesitated only a moment longer before reaching for the pen. The room was silent except for the soft scratch of ink. Across from me, Ethan's phone buzzed on the arm of his chair. The screen lit up just long enough for me to catch the preview. We need to talk. Urgent. The sender was Harold. The careless leave traces, the desperate leave trails. The city outside my penthouse was a scatter of faint lights against the dark sweep of the Potomac. Inside, the only illumination came from the pale glow of my monitors, their shifting graphs and coded readouts painting my hands in cold blue. The war room might have been miles away, but the hum of encrypted channels and the murmur of the cyber team in my earpiece gave the room the same taut energy. Dan's voice came through the secure line, clipped and certain. We've got proof. Ethan's been in contact with Harold. Encrypted messages routed through 3 VPNs and a compromised medical network. I leaned forward, fingers flying across the keyboard. Send me the logs. Seconds later, the metadata appeared. Each hop, each relay, clean enough to fool most, but the originating device signature was distinct. A high-end model phone Ethan had flaunted at last year's family holiday party, custom case and all. Amateur enough to keep it, arrogant enough to think no one could trace him. I isolated the relevant packets and opened the raw message capture. No full content, yet, but enough in the headers to confirm pattern, time, and urgency. Screenshots followed, file names stripped, image data compressed for speed. Dan exhaled on the line. "You want me to flag this with the Bureau?" "Not yet." My eyes scanned the packet data again, looking for an angle that would do more damage indirectly. "We let Harold know someone's watching, but not who." I encrypted a fragment of the metadata, the parts pointing toward a breach, but scrubbed of any direct identifiers, and sent it to Charles with a single instruction. "Have this accidentally surface to the board. No attribution." The reply was near instant. "Consider it done." From there, it was a matter of waiting. Less than 40 minutes later, a secure channel from Charles lit up again. "Harold's been pinged. Board member leaked it in casual conversation. He's rattled." I switched to the live monitor feed on Harold's network segment. Traffic spiked, an outgoing burst toward an unlisted contact. Dan patched into the line. "He's messaging Ethan now." The transcript scrolled in as the team decrypted in real time. It was brief, hurried, every keystroke landing like a step on broken glass. "Don't let her find out. Sometimes you don't need to hear the whole truth, just sit at the right table." The restaurant was all muted lighting and whispers, a place designed for expensive secrets. My reflection in the polished brass sconces barely looked like me, hair darker, makeup understated, jacket nondescript. From 2 tables away, I had the perfect angle. Harold and Ethan, seated in a shadowed corner, their profiles outlined by the soft amber glow. My bag rested casually against the leg of my chair, the directional mic inside already live. Each clink of cutlery, each shift in tone was mine to keep. "It's becoming a problem," Harold was saying, leaning forward with the air of a man discussing a weather forecast rather than corporate sabotage. "That engineer, what's his name? He's been talking to people outside the company." Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You mean about the breach?" A beat of silence. Then Harold's voice dropped lower. "Let's call it a misunderstanding, one we can resolve before it spreads. Offer him something. Or make sure he's reassigned somewhere far from sensitive systems." I caught the faint hesitation in Ethan's voice, a crack in his practice arrogance. "That's not exactly necessary," Harold interrupted smoothly. "You don't understand, Ethan. Once these things go public, they spiral. And when they spiral, people start digging. We can't afford that." The mic captured every word, the low menace wrapped in civility. I pulled out my phone beneath the table, screen dimmed, and routed the live feed to Charles's secure channel. A single message followed. "Listen now." From here, the rest would handle itself. The conversation was evidence, the kind that didn't just point fingers, it locked them in place. Across the room, Harold's phone buzzed against the linen. He glanced at the screen, and whatever color remained in his face vanished. Ethan noticed, leaning in. Then Harold froze mid-breath, eyes flicking over Ethan's shoulder toward me. Ethan turned in his seat, scanning the room. His gaze landed on mine. "When the government calls, you don't ask why. You ask when." The Department of Homeland Security building loomed ahead, all sharp lines and security glass reflecting the pale autumn sun. The guard at the entrance scanned my credentials without a word, his eyes flicking up just once before waving me through. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh toner, and the corridors hummed with a quiet urgency that said people here understood the weight of what they handled. Dan was already waiting in a small conference room off the main corridor, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. A single manila envelope lay in the center of the table. "They've made it official," he said, sliding it toward me. I broke the seal. The words were stark and unadorned. "You are hereby summoned to testify before the House Committee on Homeland Security regarding the ongoing breach affecting critical infrastructure systems." The attached list of named entities made my jaw tighten. Pierce & Co. in bold, Harold Stein right below it. I looked up. "They're going to make this public." Dan nodded grimly. "Not just public. Live streamed. Every word you say will be picked apart by analysts, shareholders, political opponents, and Harold himself." A flicker of an older memory cut through the moment. Me, years ago, in another sealed room, delivering testimony that would never see the light of day. Back then, every detail had been redacted before it could leave the building. This time, nothing would be hidden. The door opened, and a woman in a tailored navy suit stepped in. Elena Hart, the congressional liaison. She carried herself with the precise economy of someone used to tight schedules and tighter budgets. "Miss Pierce, your slot is confirmed for the morning session. You'll be under oath. Questions will cover both the current incident and any relevant historical events. We understand there was a similar breach in 2019? Before I could answer, Dan glanced at me, a silent question. I gave the smallest nod. "Yes," I said, "and it's relevant." As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen. I stepped out into the hall to answer. "I'll be there," she said without preamble. "On the record, they need to hear what happened in 2019 and how Harold buried it." The weight of that landed like a steel beam. With Eleanor's testimony, the hearing wouldn't just be about a breach. It would be about the deliberate cover-up that followed. There would be no quiet settlements, no deals struck in back rooms. Back in the conference room, I slid the summons into my bag. "Looks like we're going to war in daylight," I said to Dan. He gave a tight smile. "Better in the open than in the shadows." As we left the building, the sky overhead was sharp and clear, the kind of cold blue that made every edge feel closer. My phone buzzed again. Ethan's voice came through, low and urgent. "We need to talk. Before it's too late." When the golden child asks for a private meeting, the facade is cracking. The park was nearly empty, save for a few dog walkers and the occasional jogger tracing lazy loops around the pond. Late afternoon light filtered through the turning leaves, casting the grass in a fractured gold that didn't quite warm the air. I spotted Ethan by the bench near the stone bridge, hands jammed into the pockets of a coat that probably cost more than most cars. He didn't look up right away as I approached. Instead, his eyes followed the ripples spreading from a mallard that had just landed on the water. "Thanks for coming," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual polish. "This must be serious," I said, standing until he motioned to the empty spot beside him. "It is." He glanced at me, then back at the water. "The article about you." I gave Harold some of the background. I thought it would take you down a peg. Remind you you're not untouchable. The admission landed without fanfare, but my pulse beat harder in my ears. "You handed him ammunition without asking what he'd do with it." His jaw tightened. I didn't know he was going after the company, or that He broke off, pulling in a slow breath. "He deleted the security logs from the breach. Vital ones. Gone. No one's supposed to be able to prove the timeline now." "That's obstruction, Ethan. And if you sit on it, you're complicit." He shifted on the bench, turning to face me. "So what? You want me to hand him over on a silver platter?" He'll burn everything on his way down, including Dad. Or you could stop him before he takes the whole family with him. My tone was even, deliberate. Testify. Put it on the record. You'll have a chance to tell your side before someone else writes it for you. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling the branches above us. His gaze flicked to mine, then away. You always make it sound so clean. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You tell the truth, or you go down with him. There's no middle ground this time. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the choice was pressing straight into his bones. I'll think about it, he said, the words flat, but not final. I studied his profile, searching for some sign, resolve, fear, defiance, but his expression gave me nothing. He rose without another word, pulling his coat tighter against the breeze. As he walked toward the path leading out of the park, his shoulders stayed tense, his stride measured. I couldn't tell which way he'd go. No battlefield burns brighter than one under live television lights. The hearing room was already electric when I stepped inside, the air tight with perfume, coffee, and anticipation. Marble columns framed the dais where the committee sat in an arched row, each member flanked by aides and stacks of briefing folders. The cameras along the side walls tilted and adjusted as I moved to my seat, their lenses following every step like rifle scopes. Across the room, Harold sat with his attorney, the set of his jaw aimed at calm defiance, but betrayed by the nervous flick of his pen. His suit was impeccable, tie knotted like a perfect noose. I knew the performance well. He'd worn it 5 years ago when the press crowned him the savior of Pierce & Co. When the chair recognized me, I began with the facts, dates, IP logs, attack vectors, delivered in measured tones. I laid out the 2019 mobilization as more than a corporate save. It had been a national security intervention, one Harold had leveraged for personal credit. Screens behind me lit up with archived communications, still frames of Harold entering press briefings he hadn't earned. Then I advanced to the present. We traced the breach to a shell company registered in Nevada, linked directly to Mr. Harold Stein, I said, and signaled to the tech officer to play the recording. The tinny restaurant ambiance filled the room, cutlery on china, low voices. Then Harold's own voice, rich and clear. Let's call it a misunderstanding, one we can resolve before it spreads. The line about silencing the junior engineer landed like a gavel strike. That recording is a fabrication, Harold snapped, leaning forward, doctored, out of context. Before I could respond, Charles's voice carried from the witness table behind me. The chain of custody is intact. The metadata verifies authenticity. Eleanor leaned toward her microphone, her tone cool as steel. And I was present for the capture of that audio. In 2019, Harold's interference cost this country weeks of recovery time. This is not a new pattern, it's escalation. The room murmured, press pens scratching furiously. Then, from the far end of the witness table, Ethan rose. His face was pale but set. Harold was behind the breach, he said, voice steady. And the smear campaign against my sister? I gave him information without knowing the full scope, but I've seen enough now to tell the truth. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the breath before impact. The committee chair adjusted her glasses, glanced at her notes, then looked straight into the nearest camera. This committee will refer Mr. Harold Stein to the Department of Justice for further action. The flashbulbs popped like artillery fire. Harold's shoulders stiffened, but the fight was over. An empire of arrogance doesn't need bullets to collapse. Truth will do. 2 days after the hearing, The top floor of Pearson Company felt like a different country. The usual air of superiority that clung to the boardroom had thinned, replaced by the scent of coffee gone cold and the restless shifting of people who knew the spotlight was still on them. The long mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lights, but the seat Harold once occupied sat conspicuously empty, a leather-backed reminder of how fast power could evaporate. His nameplate was gone. In its place lay a crisp folder marked vacant. Charles stood at the head of the table, flanked by legal counsel. Effective immediately, Harold Stein has been removed from all positions within Pierce & Co. He is under criminal investigation and will have no further access to corporate systems or facilities. The words were measured, but the edge in his voice made them feel like final blows. Across from him, Richard Pierce's usual confidence seemed subdued, the faint slump of his shoulders betraying the toll of the last week. He cleared his throat, glancing down at his notes before looking straight at me. The board has approved a complete security overhaul. Charles will lead implementation, he hesitated, with oversight from Alexandra Pierce. The surprise was audible in the murmurs around the table. Richard had never so openly acknowledged my role in anything tied to the company, let alone ceded authority. When he continued, the formal tone slipped. On behalf of this board and this family, thank you, Alex, for protecting what we nearly lost. Twice. So the weight of the moment pressed against me, but I refused to let it soften my stance. I kept my voice even. I work for my country, not for this family. The words landed with a quiet finality, not meant to wound, but to draw a line they could no longer pretend wasn't there. A beat of silence followed, then the shuffling of papers as Charles moved to the next agenda item. The meeting closed on polite applause, though I caught more than one sideways glance, calculating, perhaps even grudgingly respectful. I stepped into the corridor, the tension in my shoulders loosening for the first time in weeks. The glass walls reflected a cleaner version of the company's future, stripped of Harold's shadow. But before I could head for the elevator, I heard footsteps quicken behind me. Ethan was there, tie loosened, expression unreadable. Alex, he said quietly, as if testing the name. His gaze flicked away, then back. Maybe we could start over, as siblings. The question hung between us, heavier than the fall that had just taken place. Justice delayed is still justice. It just leaves a deeper scar. The last light of October bled across the Potomac, spilling into my penthouse like molten copper. I stood in the center of the room, still in uniform from the day's briefings, the envelope lying unopened on the coffee table. It had been hand-delivered. No email, no ceremony, just the weight of its seal staring back at me. When I finally broke it, the words were short and official. Effective immediately, Alexander Pierce is promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, United States Army. No flourish, no unnecessary adjectives. Just the truth. The kind that didn't need to shout to change a life. Eleanor appeared from the kitchen with 2 glasses of champagne. She didn't wait for me to say anything before raising hers. Silence was your sharpest weapon, she said. The faintest glimmer of approval in her eyes. You used it well. My Dan, patched in on the secure video screen propped against the far wall, grinned like a man who'd watched a long game finally pay off. You've earned this, Alex. Every scar, every quiet fight no one saw, it all counted. My phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. I'll earn your respect, Alex, not in words, in time. I read it twice, my thumb hovering over the keyboard before setting the phone down without replying. Some promises needed proof, not acknowledgement. I drifted toward the window, the champagne glass warm in my hand. The city spread out beneath me, bridges lit like veins, water catching the last ember of daylight. My other hand rose unconsciously to the new insignia on my shoulder. The metal was cool, almost grounding. I let a slow smile form, not for the promotion, not even for the victory, but for the knowledge that I'd played by my own rules and won. The phone rang again, different tone, different line. I didn't need to check the display to know it was the secure channel.
Another mission was waiting.
Justice might have been served here, but the world had more storms ahead. I set the glass down, squared my shoulders, and answered. Truth had stripped away every layer of deception, leaving those who schemed with nothing but their own downfall. The journey proved that justice may be delayed, but when it arrives, it strikes with a force no lie can withstand. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. Like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this story. Comment 1 if you felt the same, or 2 if you think it could have ended differently.